What if the greatest trick power ever pulled was making us ask for it? We like to believe we are free. We walk our own path, make our own choices, speak our own truths. But hidden beneath this confidence is a quieter instinct, the craving for something or someone to follow. The paradox is this: when offered freedom, most people don't run toward it. They hesitate. They glance back. They wait for instructions. Why? Because freedom, real freedom, is terrifying. It demands that we become fully responsible, not only for our actions, but for their meaning. It strips away the excuses, the safety net, the structure. And for many, that feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. Erich Fromm called this the escape from freedom. He argued that while modern society has granted us individual liberty, it has also left us isolated, uncertain, and desperate for belonging. And so, in response, we seek refuge, not in liberty, but in authority, not in choice, but in certainty. This is not submission by force. It is submission by comfort. Consider the story of the elephant trained from birth. As a calf, a chain is tied around its leg, too strong to break. It learns the boundary. Learn that resistance is futile. And as it grows, even though it gains the strength to break free, it never tries, because it doesn't need the chain anymore. It only needs the memory of it. That's how most people live. They stop at invisible walls, habits, beliefs, roles, never questioning if the barrier is real, never realizing it was once built but long since abandoned. And the deeper tragedy? They find safety in that limitation. They call it identity, maturity, loyalty, but it's only the echo of a command they no longer need to hear in order to obey. Modern life is filled with these subtle cages, career paths that were chosen for us, moral frameworks we never examined, worldviews we inherited like family heirlooms. And yet we cling to them, not because they liberate us, but because they organize our chaos. Control, in its most elegant form, doesn't need violence. It only needs familiarity. That's why the most powerful authorities rarely shout. They whisper. They don't chain your body. They cradle your fear of the unknown. They offer you something priceless in exchange for something invisible. They offer belonging, clarity, and identity in exchange for your silent agreement to stay in line. And so we do. Not because we're weak, but because we are wired for safety, and safety often looks like obedience in disguise. The cage doesn't rattle. It doesn't creak. It just feels right. And when something feels right for long enough, we stop asking why it exists. But that's the first step toward submission. Not when we are forced to obey, but when we choose not to question. So the real question isn't, are you free? It's, have you ever tried the door? Because maybe, just maybe, it's been open all along. What if the story you live wasn't written by you? What if your dreams, your habits, your sense of right and wrong were all pages in a script handed to you before you ever learned to read? From the moment we enter the world, we're surrounded by stories, not just in books or bedtime tales, but in the way people speak to us, the rules they enforce, the praise they give, the punishments they deliver. Over time, these stories solidify. They become roles. Roles we are expected to play. Be a good student. Be a loyal worker. Be patriotic. Be humble. Be normal. We don't question where these roles came from because they're introduced so early. They feel like reality itself. But what we call normal is often just culturally convenient obedience. French philosopher Louis Althusser described a process called interpolation, a subtle form of conditioning where individuals are hailed into identity. You're not born a citizen or a consumer or a believer. You're shaped into one by the structures around you: education, media, religion, family, each one pulling a string that tells you how to act and who to be. The effect is eerie. Like actors on a stage who've forgotten it's a performance. Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious adds another layer. It suggests that beneath our personal experiences lies a shared psychological architecture full of inherited images, archetypes, and symbols that guide our behavior without our awareness. We don't just follow rules, we embody them. We become walking metaphors of a culture we never consciously chose. Think of the rituals embedded in everyday life, standing for an anthem, raising a hand in class, saying "I do" at a wedding. Each one is loaded with assumptions and expectations. You don't need to be told they matter, you just know. And that's the point. Obedience isn't imposed. It's embedded. Even language itself betrays us. Words like success, failure, freedom, or terror aren't neutral. They've been framed, shaped, weaponized. When a government calls dissenters threats, or an ad calls consumption empowerment, the script is reinforced. Not by argument, but by repetition, by familiarity. By normalization. We are not just thinking beings. We are storytelling beings, and whoever writes the story writes the soul. The danger isn't that we're being lied to. The danger is that we're being scripted so subtly, so consistently, that we begin to lie to ourselves. We call it tradition, or responsibility, or common sense. But really, it's just the performance continuing without a director, because no one remembers when the curtain first rose. And yet, some people start to notice. They sense that the lines they're reciting don't belong to them, that the applause feels hollow, that the stage doesn't match the world outside. It starts as a quiet discomfort, the feeling that something isn't quite real, and once that suspicion takes hold, the story begins to crack, because only when you realize you're in a script can you begin to rewrite it. What if your strengths are being used against you? Most of us believe that praise is a reward, a sign of doing something right. We work hard, achieve, improve, and in return, we are recognized, applauded, elevated. It feels good, encouraging, validating. But beneath that feeling hides a question we rarely ask: why does praise work so well? The answer begins with something simple but powerful: conditioning. B.F. Skinner, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, showed how behavior can be shaped not just through punishment, but through positive reinforcement. Rats in boxes learned to press levers not out of understanding, but because they were rewarded when they did. Praise is our lever. Approval is our pellet. And we press the lever again and again. We learn quickly that certain behaviors earn rewards. Compliance earns praise. Agreeableness earns trust. Modesty earns admiration. But over time, this reward system doesn't just shape our actions. It shapes our identity. We begin to perform virtue, not because it's true to us, but because it earns applause. This is where Nietzsche's idea of slave morality enters. He argued that societies often reward traits like humility, obedience, and self-sacrifice not because they're noble, but because they serve power. People are trained to be good in a way that preserves the status quo, to be submissive in ways that feel admirable, and so excellence becomes domesticated. Rebellion is smoothed over. Radical honesty is replaced by palatable virtue. Don't need to be forced into submission. You just need to be praised for behaviors that make you easier to manage. And praise doesn't come from one place, it comes from everywhere. Institutions reward the loyal. Social media rewards the agreeable. Relationships reward the non-threatening. Over time, we learn what earns applause and what earns silence. And slowly, unconsciously, we edit ourselves. But here's the trap. The more applause you get, the harder it is to stop performing. Because now your identity depends on it. You begin to fear losing it. You avoid speaking the uncomfortable truth. You suppress the instinct to deviate. You stay on the pedestal, smiling, not because it's where you belong, but because the mask you wear is too valuable to take off. Admiration, when attached to performance, becomes a prison made of gold. You're free to move, but only within the lines that earn you validation. You're celebrated, but only for the version of you that fits the system. The real you, that part quietly retreats. Until one day, it becomes unrecognizable, buried beneath layers of applause, reputation, and expectation. And so what looked like empowerment was actually containment. What felt like freedom was a script written by other people's desires. Because in the end, the system doesn't care who you are. It only cares that you're useful, and praise is the soft chain that makes you grateful to wear it. There's a quiet terror more primal than violence, more lasting than punishment. It's the fear of being cast out, of being seen and rejected. For most of human history, survival depended on the group. To be isolated was to die. Exile wasn't just a punishment, it was a death sentence. But even now, long after the threat has faded, that fear remains embedded deep in the nervous system. We still live in tribes, only now they're psychological. This fear is what keeps us in line, even when no one is watching. Jean-Paul Sartre called it the gaze of the other, the idea that we define ourselves not just by what we think, but by how we're perceived. The moment we sense someone watching, our behavior changes. We edit ourselves, we perform. We become both actors and audience simultaneously, presenting an identity and judging it through someone else's eyes. But what happens when that gaze becomes permanent? We live in a world saturated by visibility, social media, surveillance, social norms that reward image over essence. We're always being watched, if not by others, then by the version of ourselves we imagine they're seeing. And in that constant gaze, authority finds its most insidious hiding place. It doesn't need to enforce the rules anymore. We do that ourselves. We critique our thoughts before they're spoken. We measure our choices against imaginary reactions. We ask ourselves, not, is this true? But will this make me look good? Over time, our inner life becomes a performance, rehearsed, refined, and hollow. This is what Lacan called the mirror stage, the moment we first form a sense of self through reflection. But in adulthood, that mirror never disappears. It just multiplies. Every interaction becomes a surface that reflects back who we're supposed to be. And the more reflections we collect, the harder it becomes to locate the real self beneath them. You can feel it when you hesitate before sharing an opinion, when you second-guess a strange outfit, when you suppress an impulse that doesn't align with the role you think you're supposed to play. It's subtle, automatic, instinctual, and it feels like self-control. But often, it's submission in disguise. Authority no longer needs a throne. It lives inside your conscience. A voice shaped by society, by conditioning, by the constant hunger for approval. You think it's your own, but it's built from the fragments of every disapproving glance, every rule absorbed without question, every judgment internalized and replayed 1,000 times. This is how conformity survives. Without enforcement, shame becomes the warden. Image becomes the cage. And the deeper tragedy? The more obedient we become, the more invisible the authority feels until it's indistinguishable from our own will. We call it maturity. We call it politeness. We call it being a good person. But what if those are just sanitized terms? For self-surveillance? What if the fear of not fitting in is the leash we never see? Because in the end, control doesn't need to strip away your freedom. It only needs to convince you that someone's watching and that being yourself is a risk you can't afford to take. We tend to think of logic as the ultimate safeguard against manipulation. As long as we're rational, we tell ourselves we can't be fooled. But what if logic, too, could be weaponized? Not all prisons are built from emotion. Some are constructed from syllogisms and statistics. Their bars are made of facts, but their function is the same: to contain, to restrict, to maintain a particular version of reality. The danger lies not in reason itself, but in who gets to define what counts as reasonable. Michel Foucault called this a regime of truth, not truth as an objective, timeless reality, but as a system of knowledge shaped by power. Under this regime, only certain perspectives are considered legitimate, certain arguments are permitted, certain conclusions are sanctioned. Anything outside of that carefully drawn perimeter is labeled irrational, dangerous, or simply absurd. And most of us never question the perimeter, because it's wrapped in the language of objectivity. This is the genius of modern control. It no longer needs to burn books. It simply floods the world with information, then tells you which information is reliable. It no longer needs to ban dissenting voices. It just labels them as conspiracy theorists, pseudoscientists, or extremists. Think of how often you've heard someone discredited not because their ideas were disproven, but because they didn't come from the right institution, the right degree, the right credentials. Truth has become a credentialed performance, and in this performance, Orwell's notion of doublespeak becomes disturbingly real. Peace becomes war. Surveillance becomes safe. Compliance becomes freedom. Each redefinition is wrapped in logic. It makes sense. And because it makes sense, we believe it must be true. But sense is not truth. It's structure. And structure can be engineered. Entire systems of oppression have been justified with brilliant logic. Slavery, colonialism, eugenics, mass surveillance. All were once defended in calm, intellectual tones. All had experts. All had data. All had consensus among those allowed to speak. Even today, debates are often won not with deeper insight, but with the better use of sanctioned language. Use the wrong terms and you're dismissed. Frame the issue outside the accepted template and you're irrelevant. The discussion isn't closed because it's solved, it's closed because it's been standardized. We don't fear open minds. We fear uncontrolled frameworks. So we stay inside the logic we've been given. We speak in safe ideas. We think in predictable patterns. We begin to treat the current model of truth not as a lens, but as the whole landscape. And the more we trust it, the more invisible it becomes. This is how reason, stripped of critical self-awareness, becomes a form of submission. It parades as freedom of thought, while quietly filtering out anything that might challenge the foundation it's built on, because the most effective cage is the one that convinces you it's a compass, and the deeper tragedy, you'll follow it faithfully, even when it points you in circles. Fear has a unique power. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for logic. It bypasses thought and strikes straight at the survival instinct. And when fear enters a room, freedom quietly leaves. But fear doesn't just control individuals. It controls societies. One of the oldest tools of centralized power is the creation of an enemy, a figure, a group, an outsider who becomes the focal point of dread. Because when people are afraid, they seek protection. And protection comes at a cost. Autonomy. In moments of crisis, humans look for strong hands and simple answers. We surrender complexity in exchange for safety. We give up liberty for the illusion of control. And those in power have always known this. Thomas Hobbes, in his work Leviathan, envisioned society as a chaotic battlefield of selfish individuals. To avoid descending into anarchy, people would willingly hand over their freedoms to a sovereign, a central authority, who could impose order and protect them from each other. But what happens when the fear isn't real, only made to feel? Real? Modern propaganda doesn't need to invent facts. It only needs to shape perceptions. It reframes the other, the foreigner, the protester, the outsider, the dissenter, as not just different, but dangerous. Over time, we stop asking who they really are. We only ask what threat they represent. A society that fears collapse can be convinced to accept surveillance. A population terrified of disease can be made to accept isolation. A culture told it's under attack will silence itself in the name of unity. And each time we make that trade, the structure grows stronger, not by force, but by consensus. We start to believe that unity means uniformity. That loyalty requires obedience. That freedom must occasionally be suspended for the greater good. But the greater good is a shapeshifter. It's defined by whoever holds the megaphone. And fear ensures that no one questions the message too closely. Historically, this pattern repeats with chilling precision. The Red Scare in America, the demonization of Jews in Nazi Germany, the labeling of whistleblowers as traitors. Always, there's a figure, real or constructed, who becomes the symbol of instability. And always, the result is the same: consolidation of power, erosion of rights, and mass compliance dressed as patriotism. The fear of the other is rarely about the other. It's about us, and how easily we are led when the unknown is painted. As evil. It unites us, yes, but only against something. That's not a community. That's crowd control. And the crowd, once mobilized by fear, doesn't need to be restrained. It restrains itself. It watches, policies, and punishes anything. That looks like deviation. Suspicion becomes virtue. Conformity becomes heroism. In the process, individuality disappears. Thought collapses into slogans. Nuance dies in the roar of the mob. The enemy we feared becomes less dangerous than the control we invited in to protect. US from them. Because in the end, fear doesn't just divide us from each other. It divides us from ourselves. What if being yourself was just an echo? We like to think of authenticity as a kind of rebellion, a courageous act of self-expression. But peel back the surface of even the most original identities, and you often find something stranger: imitation, patterns, replication, mannerisms, opinions, even emotions, all absorbed, reflected, repeated. René Girard called this mimetic desire, the idea that we don't want things independently. We want what others want, not because we need it, but because they do. Their desire signals value, and so we chase it, not the object, but the imitation of the one who values it. This is how influence becomes internalized. You don't copy the king's orders. You copy his posture, his tone, his desires. You align your wants with his, not because you agree, but because somewhere deep down you want to be him. Mimicry is how children survive. But it doesn't stop when we grow up. Look around and you'll see it. Trends that sweep through cities like wildfire. Opinions that morph overnight with no memory of the shift. People who subtly reshape their beliefs, not through evidence, but through proximity to authority, charisma, or social capital. And the strangest part? They're often not even aware it's happening. The influencer becomes the template. The leader becomes the mirror. The crowd becomes a chorus, not by force, but by desire. Desire is the most silent form of control. It doesn't command you. It compels you. In every era, there are dominant forms, ideals of beauty, success, virtue, rebellion. And to exist within that era is to unconsciously bend toward them. You modify your image. You soften your voice. You recalibrate your ambition to match what's desirable in the eyes of the system, and you think it's your idea. That's the trick. Even defiance can become performance. You rebel, but only in the ways that are fashionable. You resist, but only within the lines already drawn. You become an individual in precisely the same way thousands of others do, by mimicking a slightly different mask. What feels like uniqueness is often just refined conformity. Even authenticity becomes a brand, and then you wake up one day, surrounded by people who all sound vaguely the same, dress the same, argue the same. You see yourself reflected in every direction, but it no longer feels like you. It feels like a performance you forgot how to step out of. This is where admiration curdles into alienation. Because if everything is mimicry, if our desires are borrowed, our thoughts shaped, our personalities constructed through invisible imitation, then what is left of the self? Have we chosen anything at all? Or have we simply followed the reflection of someone else's longing? Imitation is not submission in chains. It is submission in the shadows. A silent agreement not to lead, but to follow, not overtly, but inwardly. Not because we were forced, but because we didn't know we had another choice, because in a world of mirrors, the most terrifying thing isn't losing yourself, it's realizing you never found yourself to begin with. What if, after all this, you weren't the one being controlled, but the one holding the strings? There's a final twist in the story of submission. A quiet, haunting truth that often goes unspoken. You might be the authority others unknowingly submit to, not through status, not through force, but through presence, through the unconscious weight of your certainty, through the shape of your silence, through the way you walk into a room and things shift, subtly, invisibly, as people orient themselves around you. Most of us don't think of ourselves as powerful. We think of power as something external, worn like armor, announced through titles, uniforms, credentials. But real influence is rarely that obvious. It's ambient, atmospheric. It flows around people who seem anchored, people who appear to know who they are, even when they don't speak. And when we carry that kind of presence, others project authority onto us, even if we didn't ask for it. Carl Jung wrote of the shadow, the part of ourselves we refuse to see, most associated with darkness, trauma, and taboo. But there's another side to the shadow, the parts of ourselves that are powerful, even luminous, but terrifying to claim, the part that commands respect without asking, the part that could lead but chooses to hide behind doubt, the part that alters the emotional climate of a room without even trying. Because influence, especially the silent kind, doesn't need to be intentional to be real. In ancient myths, the true leader was often the one who didn't want the crown, the reluctant hero, the hesitant king. Power found them not because they chased it, but because they embodied something others lacked: clarity, conviction, courage. And that, in itself, became a magnet. But here's the danger. When you're unaware of your influence, you can become dangerous without meaning to. A single offhand comment can shatter someone's confidence. A raised eyebrow can kill an idea. A moment of indifference can feel like exile to someone looking for your approval. Without realizing it, your shadow stretches over the lives of others, shaping their thoughts, their choices, their self-perception. And if you've never stopped to look at that power, you're not free from it. You're just using it blindly. That's the final paradox. The more you disown your power, the more likely you are to misuse it. We spend so much time fearing those in authority, presidents, corporations, governments, that we forget how often we play that role in someone else's story. A sibling, a teacher, a manager, a stranger online, a voice in someone's head they carry for years. And the people who follow you, they don't always know they're doing it. Just as you didn't once, it happens through imitation. through admiration, through a longing for something solid to hold on to in a chaotic world. And if you are that anchor, if people subconsciously organize themselves around your words, your gaze, your example, then the question isn't whether you have power. Question is, what are you doing with it? This is not a call to shrink, to become less visible, to disappear in guilt. It's a call to become conscious, to recognize the crown you never asked for and wear it not with pride, but with humility. Because now you know what it means. Now you've seen both sides of submission, the one who bends, and the one others bend toward. This isn't about dominance. It's about responsibility. We live in a world of invisible hierarchies, silent gravitational pulls, and most of the time we move through them asleep. But once you see the shape of influence, yours and theirs, the game changes. Stop playing roles. You stop chasing shadows. You stop fearing authority, because you recognize it as something not above you, but within you. The exit door never locked. The chains were made of smoke, and the authority you feared most might have been your own. Reflection, waiting to be recognized. Not to rule, but to wake up.